growing stronger. You might not want to look quite so pleased about that. We grow stronger, the world grows more dangerous. Life has a funny way of keeping things balanced.
Monkey, do you ever say anything encouraging?
I encourage you not to die.
Hi folks, I'm Ignacy Vishnevetsky.
I'm Alex Dowd.
We're coming to you this week from the AV Club studio.
Welcome to Film Club.
Fairly often here on Film Club, we find ourselves delving into the nebulous category of family films. And it's not been the greatest summer, but there have been some notable, quote-unquote, family-friendly releases in the last couple of weeks. I just caught up with Kubo and the Two Strings, title of which is kind of misleading. He has 3 strings for much of the film.
Yeah, it's the latest from Laika, which is the stop-motion house that made Coraline and Paranorman and the Box Trolls before this. And I would argue with Ghibli sort of winding down and with Pixar sort of in relentless sequel mode right now, Laika might be one of our best bets for animation now as a company.
Bet means it's not a sure thing, is what it means to me. I find everything they make to be very striking to look at. It's very pretty to look at, but I think they're still stuck in a formula of general animated films, journeys, adventures. So this is a fantasy film. It's set in a medieval Japan. You've got this little boy. He's got one eye. His grandfather's the Moon King.
And Kubo is paired with this monkey, voiced by Charlize Theron, and this samurai beetle, voiced by Matthew McConaughey. And McConaughey, I feel like, is around to sort of provide the proceedings with the necessary comic relief.
And the warmth in the voice, because it's a very Imperator Furiosa-like monkey.
Yeah, this is not a Shrek movie where you're supposed to notice who's doing these voices, and that sort of is part of the attraction. Like, oh, there's Eddie Murphy, you know? This is a movie where they are sort of just disappearing into these characters, to the point where McConaughey isn't even really doing his own Texas accent.
But yeah, it's about as close to like a mid-Atlantic as Matthew McConaughey is capable
possibly get. Yeah. A big chunk of the movie is them sort of on this quest. And sort of using his musical instrument, Kubo strums out these stories, and playing the music controls the origami. On some level, that sort of becomes like a getting into their own process, taking these physical objects and moving them around.
I do like that his problem is he doesn't know how to finish a story.
Right.
Which is also very reflective of the Laika process.
So you're a skeptic of them as an animation house.
I'm not a skeptic of them as an animation house. I am a skeptic of them as storytellers. I don't think I've ever completely felt that the emotional through lines are really developed to the point where they need to be. I found this film to be so wonderful to look at, especially when he sort of gets swept away into these far lands and they're crossing a huge lake, they're crossing mountains, they're going into underground caverns. It's basically like the Krull of animated films. It was great when it was that, and then it kind of had to have a climax where he defeats a monster and there's a lesson, and there the film actually lost me.
I think the lesson is pretty strong, though.
It's a strong idea, but it's an idea that I feel like...
thematically, I think their films are pretty strong. I agree that the storytelling isn't always as sophisticated as you'll find from Pixar,
say, Pixar.
Yeah.
And I think the reason is, you could say the moral of the story, it's a fine moral. And perhaps it would work had the film done the work of developing it from the beginning, rather than from 5 minutes before the climax.
See, I don't know if I agree with you. I think it's woven through.
I mean, I've got issues with some of the storytelling, and I do have issues with kind of the last part of the narrative. But still, it is so rare to see a film that doesn't stop to explain it. I mean, if this movie were to explain itself, it would run an hour longer, because so many unbelievable things are happening over and over. But I can't help but admire a film that just sort of lets the audience figure it out, which you don't see in films that are aimed at adult audiences.
Right. Well, one of the great things about Laika, I think, as a company, is that they do trust kids. They trust kids that they can handle stuff that's heavy. They can handle, like, themes about death and loss. They trust kids that they can handle stuff that's scary. I mean, there are moments in this that test the limits of what kids can handle occasionally, you know? I mean, you have his 2 aunts are basically the main antagonist in the film, and they're these sort of floating J-horror specters.
I've said it before, you can't make a good kids film without some potentially traumatic material. And that's a key ingredient. You've got to be able to traumatize a kid.
Right.
Speaking of quality family films, coming out recently, I also saw Pete's Dragon, which I know you went into it with very low expectations.
So it's directed by David Lowery, who made a film a few years ago called Ain't Them Body Saints, sort of this Texas outlaw movie that to me felt very detrimentally indebted to Terrence Malick. So I was sort of apprehensive about, I guess I would say interested though still to see what that particular director would do.
With the least promising of all
Right.
possible Disney
Because
material.
I revisited Pete's Dragon, something I'd seen as a kid. The 1970s one is a pretty awful film.
It's long
It's
too.
very long.
This is
It's
maybe
over 2
one
hours.
of this may be one of the few cases of a present day, bigger budgeted remake that is noticeably
Shorter,
than the film it's remaking.
Well, the original was like one of Disney's several attempts to sort of replicate the success of Mary Poppins. And its big claim to fame was that it had this animated dragon in it that was interacting with actors. And I imagine at the time was very state of the art, looks much less so today.
It's such an unappealing creature. But let's talk about the new one, because the new one is a different beast.
Well, right. Basically, it takes the foundation of the original, which is that there's a little boy who's an orphan, and he has a pet dragon, and builds this completely new story. It's now set in the Pacific Northwest.
At some point in the early 1980s, it's never quite clarified.
Yeah. For the full Spielberg effect. And this boy in the opening scene sort of survives this car accident, and his parents die in the crash, and he wanders into the woods and immediately meets this giant dragon walking out of the foliage.
You know what I appreciate is that the movie does not hide the dragon. It's very...
You see it immediately.
Yeah. It's not building up that Spielbergian moment of awe and wonder when we finally see the dragon.
Yeah.
No, the kid wanders into the woods and there's a dragon there.
Yeah.
And that gives it a kind of storybook quality.
This is plotted in a very different way than Kubo. I mean, Kubo sort of is, and then this happened, and then this happened, and this happened. Not much happens in Pete's Dragon, to be honest.
For a movie with a boy and a dragon, this is not very, very plot heavy.
Yeah. He's discovered by this park ranger, played by Bryce Dallas Howard, and the question becomes what we do with this kid who we found in the woods, and they obviously don't know that he has a dragon. But it kind of becomes this hangout movie, with the kid just sort of hanging out with this new family he has, and the issue of the dragon is sort of put aside for a little while.
We sound like the Supreme Court of a fantasy kingdom. The issue of the dragon is going to be put aside for a little while. But that is basically, that's true. Like, my favorite sequence in the film is the scene where he escapes from the hospital and runs amok in the town in his hospital gown. I mean, you mentioned Spielberg, and that's obviously a
one touchstone here.
One touchstone here, but it's not, I feel like it's not the only one. You know, it doesn't feel as much of, you could say, kind of like an Amblin love fest as something like, say, Super 8 that's referencing Spielberg so overtly. Because to me, the Spielberg film that seems to be the biggest influence here is Sugarland Express. It's not the better-known, effects-driven Spielberg films.
And I said this when writing about the film, is that a lot of people compared Lowry's last movie to Robert Altman, specifically to McCabe and Mrs. Miller. And if that was his McCabe and Mrs. Miller, this is sort of his Popeye, where he's sort of taken the requirements of this all-ages entertainment and applied his own sort of eccentric 70s style personality to it.